Why were vanilla dungeons so long? Well, because the designers thought people would only do them once. In order to explain why pretty much all of the vanilla dungeons were so long, I kind of have to explain the philosophy behind MMO dungeons at the time. Before WoW, EverQuest was the most popular MMORPG on the market, and they didn't have instance dungeons or raids. What this meant was that every single dungeon or raid boss in the game was essentially an open world dungeon or world boss. So guilds had to fight each other for the opportunity to clear dungeons, and had to fight off constant attempts to kill raid bosses. And since EverQuest had player collusion, they would sometimes hire other guilds that just had big character models to stand at the entrances of dungeons to literally body block people from getting in, just so they could complete it. And because of this dungeon design philosophy, only the most hardcore players got to do dungeons, and it wasn't something everyone was able to experience. And World of Warcraft could have easily gone down this same path, as a lot of the development team were hardcore EverQuest players. And there was a huge argument about whether or not WoW dungeons should be instanced or not. Now, we all know which side won that debate in the end, as all dungeons and raids take place in separate instances, so that anyone can do them if they want, as long as they have a group. But it very easily could have gone the other way. And since there was not too many standards when it came to MMOs yet, the standard for dungeon design was to just make them really big, kinda like D&D dungeons, which also partly contributed to their large designs, as in D&D, players basically only complete a dungeon once, and if they ever return to it, it's usually pretty much empty. And under a one-time dungeon visit rule, it makes sense for them to be big or massive and have lots of things to explore or navigate, with tons of bosses along the way. And I think it was under these two design philosophies, where developers didn't think people would do a dungeon more than once, and that there wasn't really a precedent for repeatable dungeons in mainstream games yet, that led to developers kind of going crazy with their sizes. Once they created the Deadmines, they basically used that as a benchmark for how big other dungeons needed to be, and for how raids and high-level dungeons needed to be bigger. On screen, I'll show you a little diagram of the Wailing Caverns development from the WoW Diary, and you can see the original dungeon looked pretty similar to a modern-day dungeon, before they then doubled the length of it, added side wings to it, and then added a maze section to double the size of it again. Although even at the time, they thought the maze section was a little too much, so they added little mushrooms in the cave to help navigate the maze better. Although they made a mistake, and the mushrooms blended into the environment too well, so that didn't really help with navigations very much, as people just thought it was normal ground clutter. And taking a quote from the WoW Diary, "In hindsight, it seems obvious that our early dungeons were too big. But previous MMO dungeons were epic experiences embraced by only the most hardcore players. The paradigm of big dungeons was established by EverQuest's non-instance play spaces, where play spaces needed to accommodate everyone on the server who wanted to go there. Besides, we didn't want people to play through content too fast, otherwise they'd be done with WoW in only a couple of months. What we didn't realize was how much private play spaces, instances, would shrink the amount of overall play space needed. Besides, the concept of short, one-hour dungeons didn't exist in MMOs. The closest things to one-hour dungeons were the wings of Aaron Keller's Scarlet Monastery. We learned only after shipping WoW that players really liked short dungeon runs, and so the Scarlet Monastery's wing approach was the direction taken by subsequent expansions. So basically, they created massive mega dungeons because they expected players to explore it maybe once, but they had also created a system of gearing that required players to run dungeons multiple times. And you can kind of see the disconnect between the different parts of the development team. The people who added gear to raids were not really the same people who designed the dungeons. And you also had different people who designed the fights for those dungeons. So while they were created with the intention of running through them multiple times, they were also kind of created to only be ran once, as they didn't think players would enjoy doing the same dungeon more than one time. So with future expansions, they significantly reduced the size of dungeons, and in the Burning Crusade, there was just a whole bunch of short dungeons, and occasionally they might have a dungeon that's a little bit longer than normal, but all of the biggest dungeons in the game are all still pretty much every single dungeon from vanilla WoW. And whenever they remade one of the old dungeons, they would usually cut them in parts or completely remove parts of the dungeon, like they did with Skullamonts or the Sunken Temple. They've neutered pretty much all of the original classic dungeons to the point where none of them are as long as they used to be. And you have to play classic WoW if you want to do dungeons in their original mega forms. And it turns out players like the smaller dungeons. People like to get through a dungeon quickly, and big, long dungeons are just kind of tedious once you've done them for a second or third time. So that's why vanilla dungeons were long and why dungeons after Vanilla WoW were created much smaller. Alright, and if you've enjoyed this video, I have a whole playlist of other mini videos about random WoW trivia and facts, which will be linked at the end of this one.